day, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a good week. This is Henrik Palmgren. I'm your Swedish guide to the rising tide of the true counterculture known as the real alt-right that is here to defeat the cucks, the leftists, and the liberal democracy that has taken European nations and the European people to the brink of their destruction. But as you know, this is far from over. We are just getting started. Redice.tv is the website. Subscribe to our RSS feeds, our YouTube channel, and redicemembers.com. You can follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. We have a public live stream coming up on Tuesday the 27th from the Netherlands. Before that, we have our Weekend Warrior show on Saturday the 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 11 p.m. Central European Summertime, or 2300 hours. Our guest joining us for one segment today is Paul Kersey. He's the author of the blog Stuff Black People Don't Like and has published many books on race, multiculturalism, and society, including Escape from Detroit, Black Mecca Down, Hollywood in Blackface, The Tragic City, and Whitey on the Moon. We're going to talk a bit about NASA today and the American space program. We won't be talking about the riots and the rampage in Charlotte, however. This show was recorded just a day or so before this broke out, so that's why we are not going to talk about it in this program. However, it does nothing but prove many of the points that we'll discuss in today's show. This forced multiculturalism and integration and rising antagonism by the media is leading to complete chaos. And there is no way of running a functioning civilization in this manner. It's going to be unsustainable in the long run. We'll talk a bit about Charlotte in the live show, so tune into that for more on the rampage and riots. But right now, we'll go over to our guest. Paul Kersey, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on with us.
Hey, the pleasure is all mine. How's it going today?
Very good, thank you. Hope you're doing well.
I am. I'm enjoying a beautiful Sunday. As an American, I know your audience is international, but I have been enjoying the fact that with these hilarious protests by the black NFL players against the national anthem to basically make it so that the criminal justice system can no longer arrest blacks, I no longer have to worry about watching football on Sundays. So it's a good feeling to know that my Sunday is now liberated from the opiate of America, which is you guys have soccer in Europe. It's, definitely or football in Europe, and we've got the American version of football. So,
I never knew what the draw was, to be honest. I mean, I used to do a lot of sports when I was younger. Played a lot of ice hockey, primarily, a very white sport, obviously, by the way. But I never understood the draw, to be honest, of looking at these men running around with the ball.
Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's really simple. People derive their identity from college and professional sports in America. You can no longer be proud of your ancestry. One university in Mississippi, University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, they just banned the playing of Dixie because they want to make sure that they're not seen as racist. What happened with Dylan Roof in South Carolina last year, the Confederate battle flag is still on the state flag of Mississippi. They banned that flag. And they're basically trying to destroy any roots that they have to the old Confederacy, the university actually having anything to do with the Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish tradition of Mississippi, because they don't want to lose any potential black recruits because they see their school, the university, as racist. So they've actually banned the playing of Dixie by the band. And this past weekend, they were taking signs that said, "Let the band play Dixie." The police were actually sent to take signs of people who also had the Mississippi state flag. I am not. It's on Twitter. You can actually see a video of a police officer. If your listeners have Twitter, go to Old Row. It's a fantastic Twitter handle, and it's primarily is about Southern fraternities and the great traditions they have, and they've got the video of police actually taking the signs that say "Let the band play Dixie" and forcing the people to put the Mississippi state flag up. So it's an occupied country, and but yet people still derive their identities from these silly sports. And like you said, I love to play sports. I love lifting weights. I love going on bike rides now, and I still love playing football or any sport when I get a chance. But it's when you derive your identity and waste countless hours of your time watching these sports. Well, that's when you realize you've got a really serious problem that's worse than any opiate out there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a tribal thing. I think it's people have a memory of belonging to a group. Having your little tribe or whatever you want to call it, and sports and your sports team has kind of become the surrogate for this. And I think they're still drawn to it. And as you said, maybe it's even, I don't know if it is worse in America than it is in Europe these days, but this idea that there's very little emphasis on roots and heritage and culture. So as you say, the modern context of sports, that's all we have or allowed to have left, you know?
Well, and with the University of Mississippi, they're basically severing whatever roots are with the historical university.
Exactly.
Because they're creating this new one. And it's frightening because there's so little pushback because, oh my gosh, we can't do anything to jeopardize our football season, says the alumni or current student body.
Yeah, because I wondered, Paul, why did some of these guys, you know, in these sports team just play ball, to use that pun, but with this idea that they're removing everything or protesting, you know, the anthem and everything. It seems so many of these sports guys are actually in agreement with it. It seems like they're not protesting. That's what I'm saying.
Well, the beautiful thing about the national anthem protest, I would tell you that most of the people in America who are reading the right-wing sites, who are reading, you know, your Radix, who are reading American Renaissance, VDare, they already realize that the flag doesn't symbolize and doesn't stand for us. In fact, the United States flag stands in complete opposition to our future and to our, you know, our posterity. And yet at the same time, it's a catch-22 when you see these black players. You know, America's basically been dismantled to try and create a and we bent over backwards to create opportunities for blacks, lowering standards across the board in virtually every facet of American life. And yet it's not enough for these black athletes. And, you know, last week, 6 NFL teams had black players who either took a knee or they raised the defiant black fist, the black power fist. And this week, even though there's been a shooting a police officer in Philadelphia by a deranged black guy, Philadelphia Eagles football players are going to stand for social justice. And I love it. I love it. I love it because, look, it's not our country. It's not our flag. But at the same time, NFL ratings are down because Joe Sixpack and Sally Homemaker, they still believe that that is their flag. They still believe this is their country, and they get upset with that. And so it's a beautiful thing because these protests by these black players to basically, I guess, make it illegal for police officers to arrest blacks. I guess that's what they want. I don't know. That's obviously what the Black Lives Matter and that's what Obama and Democrats want. Yeah, when they talk about criminal justice reform, it's really that simple. Yep. They want to make it illegal to arrest black males, and I assume that's what these anti-white protests by the NFL players. I guess that's their end game. And the more they take a knee, the more white men are going to turn the TV off and find something else to do, occupy their time on Sundays, Mondays, and Thursdays. It's an awesome thought, and I encourage these players to keep taking a knee. So, because you know, you never know what could, you know, it all coincides with the rise of Trump too. I mean, ratings are down significantly. I think that the Thursday night game was down something like 25% from the year before that same night, which is amazing. That's a huge drop. And I'm hoping the same thing keeps happening. And it does, you know, Trump is forcing people to assess what's going on in the country. And with all the attacks that keep happening, you know, you and I are doing this show. A day after there were multiple attacks in New Jersey and New York, and a Muslim, a Somali, stabbed 8 people, said Allah Akbar in a mall in Minneapolis. And I mean, it's incredible what's going on. And the more people who turn off from the opiate of America, which is football, on Sundays, they'll encounter these news stories and they'll wonder, hey, wait a second, while I spent the past 20 years, you know, dedicating my life to following every facet of the New York Giants football team, I lost my country, and that's right. Let's get it back. And so that's a beautiful thing.
You know, the myopic stance on some of these black athletes is just astounding. You know, they've become multi-millionaires because of the white world, you know, that have offered them everything, contracts, education, and all these things, right? And it's just not good enough. They just don't see what they've been given. And they're truly biting the hand that's feeding them.
That's the great irony of what's going on is you have to ask yourself, in what other vocation would Colin Kaepernick's labor award him a contract? I think guaranteed $60 million. I think it's like a 5-year, $110 million contract, and this guy is not even the starter for the San Francisco 49ers. So you're asking yourself, in all seriousness, where would this guy's labor be worth, $30,000? Maybe he could work at Foot Locker, I guess, and maybe make 25,000. But no, it's astounding when you look at the amount of millionaires that have been created via NFL football, the NBA, and other professional sports. Of course, Sports Illustrated article a few years ago noted that 75% of NFL players 3 years after retirement end up broke. And of course, that's just poor future time orientation on their part when it comes to saving their money. But no, the point is, and as you've so duly noted, gosh, when you think about all the ancillary money and opportunities that are around for these athletes in terms of endorsements, in terms of once their career is over, becoming a coach. I mean, that's one of the frightening things is as football becomes blacker and blacker at both the NFL and collegiate level, once these players retire, they're going to have opportunities to go be graduate assistants and work their way up to become coaches. And their racial loyalties will then be, hey, we're only going to hire black players. And so the opportunities for white players to retire and have a job as a coach or even as as one of the main analysts on the network TV shows, those drop with the correlation between the blackening of the pro sport. And I mean, you're right. It's just it is going to awaken a lot of people out there, and sports are. I mean, look, South Africa gave away their country because they wanted to play international rugby. I mean, if you've seen that movie that came out, Invictus, or done any research on one of the main reasons South Africa gave up, it's because they were upset. The South Africans were upset that, gosh, we can't play in the International Rugby Championship, and if we give up our country and let democracy to invade us and allow the black majority to have access to the ballot box, we'll be accepted by international rugby. We'll be able to play.
I didn't know that angle. That's interesting.
It's frightening because it's what ends up happening though, of course, is now you have quotas on the rugby team, so they don't have too many white players, and white players are being massively discriminated against because, hey, we can't have too many white guys on the team when South Africa's 88% black. So it is the parallels for what's going on. And, as back in 1950, when the NCAA still had a lot of segregation and they didn't allow black players to play, there was going to be a game between Georgia Tech and the University of Pittsburgh. And the governor of Georgia said, we can't allow this team to come down and play Georgia Tech because they have an integrated team, and that would be Armageddon for our civilization if we allow ourselves to be on the same playing field and admit that there is equality between us on the playing field. And he was right. Armageddon did happen for the civilization whites built in the South. And gosh, if you've been to Memphis, I just read where Memphis had their 140th murder this year. Their homicide rate is double the homicide rate in Chicago. And we always hear, oh God, Chicago, 500 murders by August 15th, 3,000 shootings by September 10th, 2016. Yet just imagine a city, Memphis, which is actually blacker. Memphis is 65% black. Chicago is only 32% black. Memphis has double the homicide rate and violent crime rate as Chicago.
I had no idea.
That's one of the things people don't realize is just how frighteningly black these cities are in the South. I mean, Birmingham is 75% black. Atlanta is one of the few cities in the South that's actually seen a resurgence of its white population as more white people finally get tired of spending 4 hours a day commuting to their little whiteutopias in the suburbs. But every other major city in the South, New Orleans, even Nashville's getting blacker. Charlotte, North Carolina is regrettably seen an increase in its black population. And with that comes the election of black city council members who agitate solely and entirely for greater access for blacks to public jobs,
Yeah.
And basically, my whole theory is that, as we see with Baltimore, which is a city that's 65% black elected officials rely on high black crime rates to stay in power because they know that, there's virtually no tax base among those who they're serving, the majority black constituents. And if you see a increase in the white population, they're going to demand greater public services, which, there's there's a dichotomy there because as a black elected official, yeah, you do want to have some things going well for your city, but at the same time, you want to make sure that black crime keeps away those who demand, hey, wait a second, we're paying all these tax dollars and all we're seeing is job programs for blacks in the summer for unemployable teens, or we're seeing more money dedicated to police programs to try and convince black people not to shoot one another. So it's an insane situation. Oh, I mean, my gosh, if you ever want to get a laugh, go to news.google.com and just type in "Stop the Violence March," and you'd be shocked how many cities. You wouldn't be shocked, actually.
I don't think so.
It's just incredible. It's incredible how many cities across the country have a Stop the Violence March every week, every weekend.
Wow.
So
we never hear about it. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting aspects here that I want to get into more detail with you. Also in terms of, what you're currently kind of writing on with Selma. We can talk a bit more about the political climate in America right now with Trump, what's happening racially. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, I guess, some of the motivations of how you ended up writing on these topics. You've written Whitey on the Moon, that I want to talk more about later too. The Tragic City, Birmingham. You've written about Detroit, Black Mecca Down, The City That Bleeds, etc. Tell us about how you ended up on this track.
Man, back in 2009, I was with some friends and we were having one of those great nights where you're drinking and trying to cure the world's ails.
Right.
And we were joking about stuff white people like. Christian Lander's webpage had produced a book that had just been released, and we were talking about how funny it was. And then someone said, we should do something along the lines of, stuff black people like. That'd be hilarious. And I said, what if we did it the other way? What if stuff they don't like? And so SBPDL was born that night. Went over and created a page real quickly and just started kind of doing numbered posts at first. And they were all jokes. Like, I'm sure you've heard that rumor that a magazine did the top 3 things that white people worry about. And it's like natural disasters, a death in the family, a car accident or something. And for blacks, it was ghosts, dogs, and registered mail. and so it was posts like that. It was just
right.
kind of it was very tongue in cheek, just trying to be funny. And then I can't remember what happened. There were a multitude of various events that took place that kind of directed the site into a different direction. And I think I started reading about Detroit, and if you don't realize, you see these cities, and if you're European listeners, you ever come to America and you visit a place like Baltimore or Detroit, you see the footprint of this beautiful city. Just you can tell that at one point this used to be a place where dreams came true, where children laughed, where families planned for a better future. And because you see these beautiful facades on these buildings that were built in the 1920s and 30s. And I'm not just talking about, single family homes. I'm talking about the skyscrapers. And with Detroit, I started researching Detroit and you realize, wow, up until about 1940, this was still a 92% white city. And it was only because the mechanical cotton picker was invented, which made black labor virtually obsolete in the South, that you had the great migration of blacks from Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama up north. It was just celebrated, of course, but it shouldn't be. It's one of the great travesties in United States history that this migration was allowed to happen, because you saw cities like Detroit, Rochester, New York, Buffalo, New York, Newark, Camden, Baltimore, Gary, Indiana, New York City. You saw all these cities overwhelmed by by black migrants from the South, whose labor was made obsolete by this incredible invention, the mechanical cotton picker. And Detroit became one of the cities that was overwhelmed by this black growth of the population. And much to my dismay in learning this, Henry Ford actually wanted to destroy the unions by having cheap black labor come up north. And there's of course a parallel to what's going on. Yeah, they would put up billboards down south, said, "Hey, come up north, work in these industries in Detroit." And there's of course parallels to that with what's going on with the Mexican illegal immigration invasion of the country. As those with capital, they want to increase their profit margins by lowering their labor costs, and that's exactly what Henry Ford did. That was his thinking with the black migration. And of course, you can't excuse the genetic differences between the white and black populations. And of course, we see in 2016, Detroit is an 83% black city, and Detroit is about hit as rock bottom as you can, and you are seeing a little bit of gentrification with whites moving back in. You've got a white mayor now and a lot of investment from a guy named Dan Gilbert who owns Quicken Loans. But it is literally, Detroit is the manifestation of Luther Stoddard and Madison Grant's theories and frightening prognostications about what would happen with the passing of the Great Race and the Rising Tide of Color, those two great books that were written in the 1920s and had so much to do with our Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. But, the more I learned about Detroit, it was just obvious that these cities that were supposed to celebrate, and these great, the election of the first black mayor in 1973 in Detroit, Coleman Young, these aren't anything to celebrate. These represent pinpricks in that, when you add them up over a long enough time period, that they represent the death of those civilizations that white individuals collectively created. And you're asking about some of the other motivations. I have fond memories, and some of your European listeners might not understand what I'm about to talk about. In America, trick-or-treating and Halloween is such a great community building event. And I wrote a piece called "Can Your City Pass the Trick-or-Treating Test?" I think I wrote that for VDare, and it basically pointed out that I looked at I think Wallet Pop or Zillow. They did a top 10 cities for trick-or-treating. They broke it down by the zip code, and I researched the racial demographics of the zip codes. And as you can imagine, it turns out that there's virtually no blacks in these top 10 cities to trick-or-treat in, because you have to have social capital in a high trust society to be able to say, we're going to let our kids go out unsupervised and knock on people's doors, and we're not going to have any fear of anything happening to our children. And when you think about that, I mean, as an American, you want to live in a community where on Halloween in October, not only are you going to be able to put up cool decorations to try and scare kids, but at the same time, you're going to invite those children to come to your front door and, give them candy and have no fear of anything happening to them, except for maybe your kids getting some weird, oh, you should celebrate Halloween because it's a pagan holiday from some goober Christian who doesn't understand how important Halloween is to building some great memories for children, but also at the same time creating the ties that are going to only increase the property value for your for the home that you own. And to me, that was one of the early posts. I think I wrote that back in 2011. And SBPDL just kind of kept going in different directions, and I'd just pick a city and I'd start researching it. You mentioned The City Too Busy to Hate. There's a great book on Atlanta, The Tragic City. I have a number of ancestors who told me wonderful memories. They're now gone, of what Birmingham was like back in when it was majority white and run by white people for the benefit of white people, as any government should be run. You want to run it for the benefit of your people, not to the exclusion of your people, as we see now, which is what our governments, which is what American governments at local, state, and the federal level do. I mean, when you consider that without government jobs, there would be no black middle class, and I've written extensively on that. I mean, back in 2011, I believe there was an article in the Washington Post that lamented that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are mortgage federally backed mortgage companies that if they went under, 50% of their employees were black, not just non-white, but 50% of their employees were black, and what that would do to this fake black middle class that's been created. And I remember just thinking, this is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, that we have allowed this artificial middle class, that these government jobs, you know, you could make the libertarian argument, oh, they shouldn't exist, blah blah blah. Well, no, I actually am not a statist, but I believe that a state should be run with putting the future as one of the most important aspects of all policy planning.
Of course.
And what we see in America is the exact opposite. We basically mortgaged our future and any hope that we might have for our children, just so we won't be called racist. And it's the same thing that's happening in Europe, all the European nations. Although Eastern Europe, I've actually looked into potentially moving over there, but it would be very difficult to learn, you know, Hungarian or Russian. But
right, yeah.
they're a lot healthier over there. And but then again, at the same time, I think we are seeing signs of life in the United States that do coincide with the election of a radically anti-white president and increasingly anti-white entertainment and also anti-white sentiment from academia and from virtually every segment of society. And I guess at some point you keep pushing people, they're eventually going to either push back or they're going to, you know, fall over and die. And that's not happening in America, not yet at least. And that's one of the things that gives me a lot of hope, is that I've seen not only just the growth of SBPDL, but just the emails I get from people in the comment sections. I mean, I'm not trying to say this just to be proud of what I've, you know, built, but the comment section at SBPDL has some of the most incredible comments, and a lot of people actually, I would say at this point, just come to the site because they want to check out the comment section, and I love that, because we have been able to build up a fantastic community of very erudite individuals who have a lot of unique life experiences to bring in, and I commend anyone out there who tries to create a site or create a podcast as you've done, or is just trying to do something unique to give voice to a people who have been voiceless for so long. And it's exciting, man. It's very exciting what's going on out there.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there's so many aspects here to what you've mentioned so far. But one of the things I wanted to kind of pick up on there a little bit is this idea of what is happening to some of the cities, because we obviously can see, as you know, same thing in Europe right now. Specifically, I remember going through Antwerp. I've mentioned this several times on the program, but it was just such an interesting experience to come into a city where basically the population had been replaced, and you had these extraordinarily beautiful facades, these buildings, you know, like the peak almost of European civilization when it comes to architecture. And then you had like basically no European or Belgian or Flemish people left. And the traffic rules had gone out the window. It felt like I was in Egypt, but it was like these monuments to an ancient civilization that had like passed or something, you know what I mean? And it's almost like I get this echo. I remember the Aztecs, right? When the Europeans first came over, I think they mentioned that we didn't build any of this, right? But they were living in the kind of the ruins of this extraordinary architectural achievement, and it's kind of the same thing. And it's just, I mean, as you say, it's beyond sad, because we're told that we're supposed to celebrate this, right? That this is somehow a great achievement of ours. It's amazing. It's amazing.
One of the great stories I read from antiquity was when Napoleon had invaded Egypt, and his army came to the pyramids, and the Bedouins, these nomadic people, were camping out in front of the pyramids, and they asked, well, who built these? What are these? And the Bedouins had no idea, even though they'd been there for centuries.
That's right. Yep.
And they had no idea. And, you know, to me, one of the great aspects of researching these American cities, and as you mentioned in Europe, just the ornate facades that exist on these just magnificent structures that were built by people who hoped that these achievements would be celebrated for centuries, as opposed to be lamented for their lack of minarets and their Christian symbols. But to me, America has one city that we're forced to celebrate every year that truly stands as the great example for why our ancestors were correct in establishing Jim Crow and in the South, which, would kept whites in charge, even though they were minorities in a lot of these cities. And that's Selma, Alabama. Selma is the city that Martin Luther King went to, where they did the march from Selma to Montgomery. And they had the infamous stand on the bridge where these white police officers, they said, you don't have a permit. They beat a number of the protesters. There was a movie made a couple years ago called Selma that a number of public school systems actually use taxpayer dollars to send all the students to go see.
Amazing.
because the movie basically created nothing but white guilt among any white kid who sees it. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. How could we have ever done this? Well, why don't we go to Selma, find out? Selma is now an 80% black city. Literally every metric that measures misery, they lead in the country. I mean, whether it's drugs, whether it's STDs, whether it's crime. I mean, Selma's homicide rate, the city's only about, it's between 20 and 30,000 people, I believe. And the homicide rate, it dwarfs, Chicago and Milwaukee and Indianapolis and Baltimore, these cities, and Philadelphia that have high homicide rates. And yet, virtually every lesson that we're taught about how evil white people are and our ancestors, everything that they warned about has come true in Selma. I mean, the buildings are all blighted. These buildings that were built for commerce and for families, commercial and residential homes, they're blighted. They're falling down because people just over time they wouldn't do the necessary repairs to keep an edifice and to keep the structural integrity of the building in place. And it looks like post World War II Germany in a lot of places in Selma, because there'll be a fire at a residential house. They'll never rebuild it, and it's just this burned out structure. And
amazing.
I remember a couple of years ago I read an article where they were really happy that some fast food restaurant was opening up, because it was the first fast food restaurant that had opened up in a decade or something, and their local paper was celebrating this as some sort of great achievement of commercialism. And it's like, this is awful. And this is embarrassing. And what's funny is in 1994, the New York Times did this great article where they lamented about they tried to write this piece about, oh my gosh, even though Selma's got a black mayor, a black police chief, majority black city council, blacks virtually running the local government, nothing's changed. Jobs didn't come here. Black on black crime is far worse than it ever was, than any crime ever was when whites were in charge. And it's like, New York Times, let's take a step back here and realize everything that you're writing, you're not coming to the conclusion that's necessary for a logical person to come to, and this is why Jim Crow was right.
Right.
To protect the civilization that whites built from being Africanized.
Well, deconstruct that a bit for us, because I just don't think people know what it is or why it even was set up.
Well, Jim Crow was set up. It was set up after 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were passed after the Civil War. And basically it was created so that the white minorities in a lot of the cities in the South, you have to remember, whites in a lot of places were minorities, and they basically created laws, whether it was poll taxes or literacy questions to be able to vote, or they just wouldn't let blacks hold public office, or let blacks enjoy the services that white people would be able to enjoy, whether it was something as simple as swimming in a swimming pool, public swimming pool, a public water fountain, riding public transportation, going to public schools. You had to have complete segregation, because going back to what I said about that football game, if at any point you allow egalitarianism, this nonsensical equality to come in, as when equality is considered the greatest goal of a nation, of a nation state, that nation won't be a state much longer.
Yeah,
and equality. Basically, Southerners had lived among blacks, among blacks for centuries. This was, and they knew about black criminality. They knew about the lack of impulse control, future time orientation, and the fact that yes, black crime had to be had to be countered. And, you always hear a lot of people, a lot of conservatives be like, oh, well, remember the time when blacks didn't have, a high out of wedlock birth rate, or,
Yeah, that's when he would better, right?
Well, no, you know why that is, and no one ever wants to point this out. Dr. Tom Sowell wrote an entire book about how evil white Southerners are and how great blacks were during the time period when Jim Crow existed. Well, that's because Jim Crow existed, and white people, Jim Crow was a check on black dysfunction. Let's just put it that way, because whites understood the level of civilization blacks could achieve, which is why they didn't want their civilization to be overwhelmed by seeing the election of black government officials, letting their kids go to the same school. So Jim Crow was a check, and yeah, it did. People are like, oh, well, that's horrible. How can you say that? Well, how can you tolerate the fact that 80% of blacks are born in wedlock? You look at our prison system in America, which is basically exists just because of black criminality. Jim Crow was simple reality of the difference of races. And, white people had a number of horrifying events to look to. You had the Nat Turner Rebellion, which, of course, is being celebrated in a movie called Birth of a Nation, where Nat Turner killed a number of white children, white women. And you had the John Brown situation. You had, let's face it, Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers knew about race because they saw what happened in San Domingo with the revolution in what is now Haiti, where all the white French were murdered on the island, and white women were taken hostage and kidnapped by the blacks who successfully led that revolution. And I'm sure your listeners know what happened to the light-skinned blacks. They were all killed by the darker-skinned blacks.
That's right.
And the darker-skinned blacks then forced, I can't remember the general's name, but he forced all of his subordinates to kill their white women slaves, or their wives, as loyalty oath to him. And I mean, Haiti was literally born in the blood of white people.
Yeah.
And
look at it today. Look at it today.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And our ancestors knew all this. That's why I can't remember what the act was, but in 1790, the United States did pass, and unfortunately this isn't in our Constitution, it should be, but only white landowning males could be considered citizens in the United States. And, people always say, well, America was set up at the beginning to fail. It was based on egalitarianism. And yeah, a lot of that's true. Yet at the same time, we did have, naturalization acts and the 1790. I'd look it up right now, but I'm on my iPad. I can't remember what exactly it's called. But the United States, our founding fathers, and our ancestors knew the reality of race. And basically, every day in America, as it's the same in Europe, we're taught the exact opposite of that reality. We're taught that a reality exists where white people must forever be subjugated because and capitulate to this idea of non-white empowerment, and that we should celebrate the fact that we're becoming aliens not only in our homeland in Europe, but also that we're being dispossessed in America, a nation that was literally forged from the blood of united Europeans from various nations who came and they did form a pretty magnificent country, which culminated, and I love saying this because you didn't mention Whitey on the Moon, and this is one of, if you ever really want to think about what white people are capable of achieving in a country where our future is the goal as opposed to eradicating our future is the goal. Think of this fact. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew for the first time in human history in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. 66 years later, on July 20th, 1969, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong stood on the moon. That's like one of the most unbelievable statistics. If you think about the first flight, 1903, we're on the moon 66 years later. And you might have,
as we know, Paul, a lot of cred for that go to the German rocket program, as we know as well, of the V rocket and all that stuff.
one of the more incredible stories is when von Braun was in an American prison after he had surrendered to Americans. He he was in a Texas prison for I believe 2 years, and he wrote out the mathematics for how we would get to Mars. And he published this book actually subsequently when he became one of the main people at NASA. And he wrote out the math while he was in jail for how to get to Mars. And there's a really cool Disney documentary you can watch. I can't remember the name, but Walt Disney became obsessed with the potential for space flight in the 1950s. And he with ABC, they did a number of these incredible specials. And Werner von Braun was one of the main people who talked about how we'd get to how we'd get to the moon and using rocketry, and how we should actually build a space station where we build the rockets in space, as opposed to having to have the rocket take the device, the spacecraft into space, which of course, as you know, that's one of the more difficult tasks. If you build it in space, you've already knocked out the whole point of having a system that can get you out of into orbit. And von Braun did this. I think this was broadcast in 1955, and then NASA, of course, was founded a couple years later. And a lot of that was due to this unbelievable series of specials that Walt Disney did, because he was so obsessed with spaceflight. And a lot of people were very upset at that time that von Braun was even allowed to be on TV. I mean, here's this ex-Nazi, blah 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 blah. It's like, hey, shut the hell up.
Yeah,
von Braun is one of the most important people who's ever lived. And I can't remember the name of his Soviet counterpart who was in charge of the Soviet space program, but I read a biography on him, and he lamented in the biography that if only he and von Braun had been on the same side, what they could have accomplished.
Was that Korolev or something? Was it
Korolev? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, Korolev. That's actually the name of the book. And Korolev, that it's like the saddest part of the book, because you're sitting there getting ready to read about this guy's life, who no one knew who he was at the time, because the Soviets didn't publicize who their top rocket designers and the people in their space program were. This all came out subsequently. But he thought that he and von Braun, what they could have done, united. And to me, that's one of the more depressing lines I've ever read.
Yeah. Because
you do wonder. It's like, wow, this guy single-handedly was responsible for Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin and all the great gains that the Soviets made that then scared America into action. And you think to yourself, my God, what if all this political nonsense, all these ideologies were thrown out the window, and the Germans and the Russians and the Americans and the British and the French and all the various people of Europe, what if we had just been on the same side at this pivotal moment in human history?
I know.
When, because von Braun, if you read anything from von Braun, you realize this guy had a vision, and he had a dream. And unfortunately, America has decided to go all in on Martin Luther King's dream as opposed to Werner von Braun's dream.
Yeah,
and I work very, every morning I get up thinking we have to break ourselves from the nightmare that is MLK's dream, because we have the blueprints for enacting Werner von Braun's dream. We know that we can do that because we did it before, and that's something that we have to always think about, is that these guys left behind an unbelievable footprint that this era is going to pass, and we will have that opportunity again, and those guys will be the heroes. And I would highly suggest to your audience and recommend reading anything you can by von Braun or that book Korolev, because it's important to read what the Soviets were capable of doing, and just how close they came to being able to do a lot of really cool stuff, like going to the moon and the plans that they had. Korolev died, I think he died in the mid-1960s, and that pretty much was the end of their dreams, because he was that much of a giant, of a scientific and technical giant, that his death destroyed the Soviet space program. But of course, the Russians now, the only way we can get to space is by paying the Russians, I think, $70 million.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? But let's talk a bit about that, because obviously today, as you know, NASA is spending the majority of their efforts and time on like trying to get Muslims into the space program. You know, it's like this hyper PC, you know, stupid organization. They're not getting anywhere. It seems like, anyway. I don't know. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I heard that after the old kind of shuttles were defunct, they were going to create this new program called Orion or something. I don't even know where they are on that level. And with, I guess, $19 trillion in debt, the U.S., there's not much money left over to this. These kinds of issues of, what do we call it? It transcends biological needs, right? That's what a previous guest said, Frank Raymond. He was talking about the white mind, the Caucasian spirit, the Faustian spirit of sorts, that actually goes beyond this aspect, that this is a biological need. That's what the space program, NASA, and all these achievements kind of is a reflection of. But why, in your opinion, is it that we're no longer going to the moon or beyond, at least with people? Why is that?
Well, I would, Whitey on the Moon is a book that it was a labor of love to write, because I remember back in the, I'm in my late 20s, early 30s, I'll just say that. And when I was younger, I got to go to Huntsville, which is where von Braun lived, and that's where the U.S. Space Rocket Center is. And I remember just being blown away by seeing all this and learning about what we had done and accomplished. Basically, when you see Apollo 13, that Tom Hanks movie, you realize, wow, we went to the moon with the slide rule, basically. When you
Right.
think about what these geniuses accomplished and what was going on, because what was still going on, despite the fact that America at that point was already conquered. NASA was one of the few agencies, government agencies, public utilities, public services, that they fought back against the mandated diversification and hiring of blacks. In fact, in a lot of articles that I've read about NASA, you find out that virtually the only employees at NASA were black employees at NASA were janitors, and there were a couple people who were in certain positions that had to have some math backgrounds, but no one really was there. There is a story though, and I can't remember the guy's name. There was a push to have a black astronaut in the early 60s. JFK actually pushed for this because they wanted to get black people on board with going to the moon, because as you realize, NASA was so white. The astronauts of Mercury, of the Mercury mission, that's the John Glenn, Gus Grissom guys, they were all white males. And there was, I just can't remember the guy's name. He was a captain of the Air Force, and much to his credit, in Chuck Yeager's autobiography, he writes about how there was a lot of people wanted to push this black pilot through astronaut
Was this Robert Henry Lawrence? Is that the guy?
No, he died. That's the guy who died. He actually died during training. This is I can't remember the guy's name. I wish I had the book in front of me, but
It's all right.
Like I said. But basically, Chuck Yeager, who was the first guy to break the sound barrier, he was in charge of the training for the NASA pilot, for the pilots who would go on to be astronauts, and he refused to push this guy through just because he was black, even though there was a lot of pressure from the Kennedy administration to push this guy through. And he was approached by General Curtis LeMay, one of the greatest Air Force, one of the greatest tactical minds when it comes to aviation warfare. And he told LeMay, what if I don't push this guy through? And LeMay said, well, I'll have your back. And so they actually were able to torpedo pushing this guy through, because he scored, I believe, the lowest in his class, and they still were trying to have this guy push through. So look, even in the early infancy of NASA, they were trying to have a black individual. And what's funny is I've gone back, and you can look online and look at the the black magazines, which are Jet and Ebony. They've got all those issues, and they write extensively about, he said that Yeager was a racist, and he said NASA was racist. So there were congressional hearings, and Jet and Ebony magazine, they wrote about all this. And, they tried to profile anyone from NASA that was black, and they really couldn't find anyone to profile. which is ironic because right now there's a movie that's going to be released in America in January called Hidden Figures, which is supposedly about these black women who did the math for the flight trajectory of all the early Mercury.
Really?
Yeah, it's insane. And it's insane to think that it's like, wait a second, we're supposed to believe that only a couple black women plotted the trajectory of these rocket launches and where they were going to land. That's insane. NASA basically invented the concept of redundancy and for project management, and they would only allow one black person, one black female, who we literally didn't know anything about until about the late 90s. I've got an article that's going to come out at VDare, hopefully shortly, that breaks down this entire ridiculous story, and it points out that it's only been about the past 10 years that we've even discovered this woman's accomplishments, which are dubious.
More revisionism, I guess.
To begin with, it's entire revisionism because, and the best way to point this out is when you realize that NASA wanted to try and promote blacks during the early stages of NASA, you realize that if this story would have gotten out, that would have been a great public relations coup. We've got this black woman who is helping out with the flight trajectory, and John Glenn said that he wouldn't get in the rocket until he knew that this woman had done the math for the flight trajectory. That's actually one of the points that we're told is true, which is like, that's bullshit. Really? That's bullshit, because if you look at John Glenn's autobiographies, he's written two, this woman's not mentioned in it. And if this were true, NASA would have used this to promote space exploration to blacks.
Of course.
In the early 1960s. And they didn't use it. Jet and Ebony would have profiled these women because they were trying to profile every low-level NASA black employee they could. And there's no mention of this woman until, like I said, the late 1990s, early 2000s. And at first it says, I can't remember the exact details of the article, but it doesn't say that she plotted the trajectory of the rockets and where they'd land when they came back into Earth's orbit. That myth kind of got created in the mid 2000s, like 2006, 2007, 2008. So like you said, it's beyond historical revisionism. It's basically trying to say, well, why haven't we celebrated this person? Well, we didn't celebrate her because all of her accomplishments are fictitious. And this is a slap in the face to all of the brave white men who collectively got white men to the moon by 1969 after Kennedy said by the end of the decade, which is truly one of the great accomplishments in human history, that we were able to do that in a span of 8 or 9 years. And I would really recommend to your audience, HBO did a docudrama called From Earth to the Moon, and it tells the whole story of the Mercury and Apollo space missions. And it is, I'm not exaggerating here when I say that it is the most impressive historical look at what white people can accomplish when individually they unite for the collective good of their people. And that's really what NASA was, because we did have a vision of where we were going to go. I mean, people in the 1960s, they didn't think that we would basically that their children would live in a future where if they went to Baltimore, they would be assaulted and beaten, or if they went to Detroit, they would just see the ruins of their civilization.
Yeah, I mean, who would believe something like that? Only a mind-controlled cult or something would be able to convince you that somehow this is a great benefit, as opposed to, I mean, anybody understandably would want to do things that is an encouragement to their own people, something that betters their people, right? I mean, think back of our grandparents and their parents and so forth. Who of them would sit, and say, "Oh, I hope in the future that my grandchildren will be displaced from the areas that we worked to build up." I mean, it's insanity,
An even better thought for you would be that if Rod Serling, who created The Twilight Zone, if he were pitched a script for a story back in the 1950s, 60s when it aired, and said, "I got an idea for a dystopian vision of the future. We show what happens when blacks take power, and we show Detroit, Baltimore, Atlanta, Memphis, Birmingham, that these cities are that the horrific visions of what we have, as whites in charge, if we put blacks in charge, let's show what happens, and we'll show these cities where people can't go out in parks at night because they're so frightened of being a victim of a crime, or you can't live there anymore because you're gonna, potentially be a victim of a home invasion, or if you try and own a business in, say, Baltimore, the people who work for you, they have to stay behind plexiglass because they're so fearful of the people who they're serving in the in the city. I guarantee you Sterling would say, no, we can't do that because A, that will prove that the racists are right, but more importantly, no one's going to believe it's going to be like that. The future is going to be better.
Yep.
It's going to be great.
It would be too unbelievable. Yep.
Yeah, and again, and more importantly, Sterling would have said, we can't validate present racist concerns for the future because then, we have to make sure that we stay on this trajectory where whites lose power, they're supplanted, and then basically all their activities and tax dollars go to benefit racial aliens. Yep. And that's what America is in 2016. And that's why there's no NASA, because NASA, we can't invest, billions into getting off this rock if, there's not a black person to celebrate as the individual who helps get us off the rock. So, it's really that simple.
It was interesting. I was looking at, some of the astronauts here, and they're even like, this is how the official world is now. Wikipedia lists, black astronauts, they list Jewish astronauts, Hispanic astronauts, and then you type in, okay, well, which one are white? Nope. Then it's list by astronauts, selection by year. It's like, we can't have, we can't be proud of our white boys who went to space, who in fact did it first. This is the environment we're in now. It's amazing, isn't it?
Well, it's only going to get far more frightening if nothing is done to dispel this just utter hatred of the past, because the past was so much better than the present, and it's only going to get far worse in the future. And you think about how this revisionism for this movie Hidden Figures, which is celebrating the fictitious contribution of black mathematicians to plotting the trajectory of the rockets. Yeah, at some point they're gonna throw in. They'll be like, well, one of the white astronauts that was part of the Mercury, he was actually black.
Oh, of course.
Or there was actually he was actually transgendered, or he couldn't tell anyone he was gay, or stuff like that.
Exactly.
Like, well, what are you talking about? Another really great book just to show you how amazing NASA was. It's to read Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff. The Right Stuff is the history of the Air Force test pilots.
That's right.
And how that's where they recruited for the early astronauts. And it's basically just a tale of badass white guys, primarily from the Midwest. And Tom Wolfe actually makes a point of that in The Right Stuff, where he points out that these guys came from Protestant Midwest upbringing. It's kind of like a Ray Bradbury, the writer, a Fahrenheit I can't remember what book he wrote.
421 or something, yeah.
Yeah, 451. He was from the Midwest too. He actually has the story in his book, The Right Stuff, about that black pilot that they tried to force on NASA. And it's just a really great book to read, because you realize he's celebrating white people and white history, and he does it in a way that, of course, now would get him sent to a gulag, to a re-education camp.
That's right.
Of course, that's where all Americans are headed. By the way, if you're part of that irredeemable basket of deplorables that Hillary Clinton mentioned
right.
in her speech 2 weeks ago before she fainted on 9/11. That's one of the things that I'm so frightened about is, what if Trump doesn't win this? What happens to all of us who are part of Hillary's list of irredeemables? And I think that you have to realize that, well, there's a guy named Solzhenitsyn who wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, And that's kind of what's going to happen to Americans.
That's right.
Seriously, I'm not trying to speak hyperbolically.
No,
I think that we need to understand these. Yeah, and read about the Bolsheviks, how they took power in Russia, and that's the end game for Whitey in America.
Well, I mean, we're not there yet, obviously, on the physical level, but we're there in terms of freezing people out and ostracization and making sure they get fired and all this kind of stuff. And the fact is, the step to the next level to this isn't that far off. But one of the other things that they're pushing or have been pushing is this idea too that we didn't really go to the moon. I'm waiting for that conspiracy to actually become official history at some point too, in this revisionist attempt. There was interesting because they actually did sneak it into what the hell was that movie called again? God,
Interstellar.
Exactly, they did sneak it in there. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
To me, Christopher Nolan's great contribution to our people was the movie Interstellar. Interstellar is one of the more racially conscious films I've ever seen. Yeah, you had a black astrophysicist in the film, which of course, no offense to Neil, well, actually great offense to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is considered this great, physicist. You go to hell, because you guys really don't exist. I'm not trying to be too overtly racial there, but let's be honest. I mean, the fact that these clowns are celebrated with virtually no scientific papers published by them, they're just these clowns. That's the best way to put it. But Interstellar is one of those movies where you talk about the Faustian spirit of European man. That movie celebrates it to a T as the whole notion of, Matt McConaughey's got that great speech where he talks about, we were pioneers. We've got to be striving for something. And he has he paints this wonderful, wonderful image of, we've got to keep moving or else we die. We've got to keep pushing forward or else, atrophy will set in and we'll be gone as a people. And there's that line where he goes to his daughter's school because he has to speak to the principal, and his daughter is brilliant. And of course, in Interstellar, the whole storyline is that it's basically a Malthusian nightmare because overpopulation destroyed our ability to feed the population. And so they actually allude to the fact that NASA was supposed to drop bombs in that movie on the third world countries because they basically were consuming far more than they produced. And so you basically find out of that movie that 90% of the world's population is dead. And so in the school, Matt McConaughey's character shows up and he's talking to the teacher and the principal, and there's a new federal textbook that states we didn't go to the moon. And it was basically a plot by the United States government to bankrupt the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War. And McConaughey looks at her. He's like, "What? You don't believe we went to the moon?" It's great because McConaughey's got that Texas drawl, and he's just incredulous as he looks at her. And to me, that whole scene, it's like, this is incredible because they will teach it. Our government, as things begin to get really bad in this country, and if something's not done, and I of course believe that things are being done and are in motion to rectify the inequities of the past and the present. But look what's just about to open in Washington D.C.
I was just going to ask you about it. Yep, yeah, exactly. Celebration to dead white men, right?
Yeah, to me that article was incredible. Steve Saylor had that on his blog, and the article in the Guardian was basically celebrating the fact that this massive, really just unattractive museum has just been built on the wall there in Washington, on the mall there in Washington. Excuse me. It's the African American Museum, and it's black. It's this very architecturally unpleasant looking building. It really is. And in the Guardian article, someone is quoted as saying, "It sure does stand in contrast to all these white marble statues." Because it looks alien. It looks like,
and they even they even said that in the beginning actually of the article. They talked about how that it's kind of like a spaceship or something, right? Wasn't it? It's amazing, and it looks like almost like something has something out of the Borg or something, in Star Trek with all these mesh metal wiring. It's very strange, very bizarre. I don't like it.
It's a very bizarre structure. and it looks incredibly alien. And of course, the whole article that the Guardian published was celebrating a building that was no longer dedicated just to dead white men, and it's my God, it is hideous. Because in truth, if you want to see the real contribution of black people to America, you just go to Detroit, you go to Baltimore. Baltimore is only about 45 miles away from Washington, D.C. Just go look at the collapsing row houses. Go look at, just this city that should be thriving, and that the only place that it is thriving is because there's basically it's a demilitarized zone, and there's cops in every corner. That's the Inner Harbor, near where, that's like the main tourist attraction. Black history is all around us. You just have to go to these cities and see the fact that, wow, there's some incredible buildings here. There's some incredible. I mean, look at these ornate. As you said about Antwerp, look at what was built here to stand the test of time. So that, like that great quote, I guess I don't know if it's from the Bible or where it's from, but a man plants a tree, even though he won't sit under its shade, his future children will, his grandchildren, his grandchildren's grandchildren will.
Yeah.
And that's what these buildings were built for in Paris and in London. And now London has a, Muslim mayor, and Paris is just a no-go area for French, for white people. And you look at the American cities, the ones we've mentioned, ones we haven't mentioned, and that's real black history. The fact that, wow, you guys have made these cities just unlivable for civilized people.
Yeah, it's just somewhere between Art Nouveau and A.R. Giger, which is the guy who designed Alien. It gives the building a look of an exotic mothership ready for takeoff. It's like, all right, you got that right. That's what it says in the article. And the last line in it, then, guys, for you who didn't read it, is despite some clunks, the result has a compelling spiky otherness standing on the mall as a welcome rebuke to the world of white marble monuments to dead white men. I mean, it's like, where is the museum to the achievement of white men? Because it's not every other museum. That's not what it is anymore. These places have become institutions of political correctness and egalitarianism and everything else. So we don't have anything that's exclusively celebrating the achievements of our people.
Well, there is one museum in Washington. It's actually out near Dulles. I've been there a couple times. It's the Udvar Space Museum, and it's got Air and Space Museum. It's the most magnificent museum I've ever been in, because it basically shows the evolution of flight. You've got hot air balloons, then you've got a replica of the Wright brothers aircraft, and then aircraft up to SR-71 Blackbird. You've got a number of incredible. You've got, actually, I think the Discovery is there, the spacecraft Discovery, or one of them is there. And then you've got a number of jets from Nazi Germany. You've got MiGs, and you've got all the great aircrafts that have the jets that have flown in the Air Force now. I think there's actually a B-52 bomber. I mean, it's just it's amazing, because all that has been in the past 100 years, and there really is no way to try and craft a multicultural narrative for these aircraft and for how they were built and for their purpose. I mean, they are, just as Charles Lindbergh said in that great Reader's Digest essay that he wrote back in the late night. I guess it was late 30s or early 40s, where he said that European man should never cede our air superiority. And it's an awesome essay, because you go to this museum and you realize, well, we haven't. we continue to craft and we continue to innovate, and basically all that our racial enemies can do is to enhance the alienness of their presence, which, as you mentioned in that Guardian piece, is this just oppressively ugly, structure that basically stands to eternally thumb an eye into blue eyes everywhere. Although, of course, to me, the most frightening monuments, yet at the same time, they have the potential to be monuments for us are in Birmingham, Alabama, where in Kelly Ingram Park. So if you're listening to us, get on your computer and Google Kelly Ingram Park, Birmingham, and look at the monuments that have been built. There is a monument to all of the. They were basically designed to try and create eternal white guilt, because they've got one monument of this really militant-looking white police officer with a dog that looks like something out of a Tolkien novel, snarling at a little black kid. And of course, Birmingham is just this hideous city now, where all these, all the homes that were once occupied by and built by white people are now falling down, and they're just structures that are abandoned. Well, that monument stands as proof about why white people long ago, when police commissioner Will Connor said, we're not going to let all these protesters win, because what happens when they won is a city that white people can no longer live in. And that's what Birmingham is in 2016. They've got a monument of the water cannons. I'm sure your listeners in Europe, and I know everyone in America, we know that a number of the civil rights protesters had a water cannon shot at them, high pressure, like a fire hose. There's actually a place where you can go and stand where there are metal fire hoses that are pointed at you, and you can get a picture of yourself taken as if you are, and you can feel that as if you were the person who had fire hose shot on you.
Oh,
and it's
man.
like, and then there's another one where you walk through down this path, and there are dogs emerging from walls that are, like snarling at you and trying to bite at you, because the German shepherds, that's what they did. The police unleashed German shepherds on these peaceful protesters.
Nazi dogs, right?
Precisely. No, you have to see these monuments.
Yeah, I'm looking at pictures of them now. I can't believe it. This is practically brand new, huh? This year or something?
They were built, I think, about a decade ago.
Oh, really? Okay, really? I didn't know. Yeah, interesting.
At the same time, I look at them and I say, well, gosh, looking at Birmingham in 2016, I think these monuments actually celebrate these guys and what they did, because they were right to do this. And, if we do end up winning, there's no reason to remove those, because those stand as a powerful monument to the righteousness and why Bull Connor should be celebrated as a hero for what he tried to do to defend the civilization white people had created from the civilization that in the absence of whites, blacks create. And that's what Birmingham is in 2016.
Oh, very interesting. Paul, we could probably go on for much longer. I know you need to run here shortly. I wanted to give you an opportunity as well to, of course, mention, the books and the stuff Black people don't like, the website, the blog, and everything else. And if you said you're writing a book as well on Selma, right? So do you have any upcoming dates on that yet?
Yeah, the book on Selma is going to be out probably before November. Basically, I'm kind of writing it thinking that Trump is going to win, and it's one of those books. Again, we have to have revisionist history on our history to tell what happened. But I believe this is the story that has to be told. What happened in Selma, because every year when our leaders go down to Selma, to the Edmund Pettus Bridge there, and march across it, basically they try and engineer as much white guilt as possible. And I look at it and I think to myself, well, you march from the city because you don't want to stay there. When the movie Selma came out in 2015, they actually had to a movie. There's no movie theater in Selma, and they actually had to rent out a theater and provide all the equipment. Oprah Winfrey did, because they were kind of embarrassed because there was no theater to show the movie.
Really?
You can't operate one, and it'd be operate as a loss. But that story has to be told. What happened to Selma? It's one of those things that when the cameras leave, when the national media leaves, people still have to live there. And what do they create? And that's what the story Selma's going to tell. And I'm also trying to finish up something on New Orleans. I've a lot of what happened during Hurricane Katrina has been forgotten, and I've done a lot of research on that. basically trying to dig up the stories of what happened in the Superdome when all the Europeans, since basically all the white New Orleans, they had fled the city. The only white people who were left were the European tourists or the Australian tourists who stayed behind, and they had no idea what it was going to be like to be around the black population. And that story needs to be told because it reminds me what happened in the Superdome reminds me a lot of what we were told didn't happen in in Cologne. And as news of that leaked out, we realized something very pernicious happened there. But the true evil was the media and the government of Germany uniting to try and keep that from ever coming out. And that story really still this day hasn't been told of what happened in the Superdome. And that's why I want to get that book out too on New Orleans, because that's another story that needs to be told of that city and the racial history.
Very interesting. Yeah. So the website is Stuff Black People Don't Like. I think you have links to most of the books there, correct?
Yeah. The website is sbpdl.com. And there are a number of books you can see. Escape from Detroit is one that I'd recommend people read because that is the story of what happened when blacks took control of Detroit. Whitey on the Moon, as you said, that's the history of NASA, the death and basically NASA ascending to when it basically was forced to put away ambitions of traversing the heavens and instead try and find black individuals worth uplifting. And as you pointed out, under Obama, it was basically to make Muslims feel good about their scientific contributions. That's what NASA has been since 2009 under Charles Holden. But yeah, the book on Atlanta, City Too Busy to Hate, Black Mecca Down, I'd recommend that. But then, again, it's if your listeners haven't ever been to SBPDL, I'd recommend they come and just look at the archives. I try and do a post every day. And, I've written extensively over at VDare, and I do a podcast now with Jared Taylor at American Renaissance, and we have some fun with that. And basically, I try and do what I can to open up those minds that are prepared for the coming deluge and the unpleasantness that is unfortunately increasingly right around the corner. And I think you'd agree with that. The
potential blight, as they say in Interstellar, right? That's what we're up against here. All right, well, very good. Thanks, Paul. We need to have you back for a part 2 at some point. It was great having you here. Thank you for your time today.
No, it was my pleasure. And again, all your listeners out there, the most important thing that we can do right now is to stay positive and to stay hungry for change, because you're going to be surprised how many other people out there are receptive to our message. And never forget, if I can leave with just one little thing, it's in 66 years from Kitty Hawk to the moon. Just imagine what can happen in 6 years if we were to actually have a couple countries that put our people first. And that's a frightening thought of what we can potentially accomplish.
That's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Live show tomorrow, Saturday 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 11 p.m. Central European Summer Time, or 2300 hours. Then on Tuesday, the 27th, we have a public live stream from the Netherlands. We have Millennial Woes, Roger Devlin as speakers, and also a third, so far unknown speaker from the Netherlands. We'll have more info for you on redeyes.tv. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/redeyesradio. And subscribe to our member section, redeyesmembers.com, to see our weekend live show and get full access to our radio archives.